when you like an early stage founder struggling and you're like, oh, but that's going to be good. I'm going to struggle. It's going to be really, really hard. But in 1 year, in 2 years, when I'm going to be bigger, it's going to be easier. I'm sorry, but it won't be easier. The truth is that each stage has a lot of challenges. And so I think something important is for entrepreneurs to realize that and enjoy what they're doing now and try to find and build the company that they enjoy building, not the joy of, getting to a Series B, getting the Series C, getting to IPO, but really the joy of building, right?
Clem, I am very excited for this. As we just said, I've stalked the shit out of you from Lee Fixel, Pat Grady, Ollie at Datadog, Dev at Mongo, Thibaut Elzière, who told me about the very early days. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited about that.
This will be great. So I want to start with a little bit of context. HuggingFace, where did the name come from? And what's the origin of the company founding in a short 2 to 3 minutes?
Yeah, when we started HuggingFace, we joked with my co-founders, Julia and Thomas, that we wanted to be the first company to go public with an emoji rather than the 3-letter ticker. We felt like the 3-letter ticker, like on the NASDAQ and all of that is kind of boring. Felt like it was time for a refresh and to finally have emojis up there on the boards. So we absolutely wanted an emoji as a name. And the truth is the HuggingFace emoji, right? The one with hands like that, was our favorite emoji. So we were like, okay, let's do that. We thought maybe we would keep it for a few weeks, like for a few months at most. And then the community started to put it everywhere, like on social media, on their clothes, like literally everywhere. So we were like, oh, maybe we're going to keep it. And now it's become kind of like such a brand, so popular that unfortunately it's going to be hard for us to change it.
Listen, at least when you do go public, the ticker will be an emoji. So, I mean, all you need to do is get to that stage. In terms of company founding, like, why did you decide this was the idea that you wanted to spend 10 years, 20 years of your life on?
We actually started with something completely different. The reality is that the company was formed because of some sort of, professional crush between me and my co-founders, where we were like, we absolutely want to work together. Plus our excitement about AI, right? It was 7 years ago, so it was not obvious as it is now. Not a lot of people were talking about it at the time, but we were super excited about it as kind of like a new paradigm to build technology, new opportunities, and all of that. The first startup I worked for like 15 years ago was already doing AI. We weren't calling it AI at the time, so I had some sort of a glimpse of the capabilities. And when we started HuggingFace, when we started the company, we're like, okay, what can we work on that is going to be both scientifically challenging? Because one of our co-founders, Thomas, is a scientist, and we all have a lot of interest in the science side of things, but at the same time entertaining. So we actually started with some sort of a Tamagotchi AI or like AI friend, however you call it, some sort of like a Siri, Alexa, or like ChatGPT, except just for like entertainment, not for like the boring like productivity aspect of it. And we actually did that for almost 3 years. We raised our pre-seed and seed rounds on this idea. We got a product out with a couple of billion messages exchanged between users and this Tamagotchi AI. But as it sometimes happened when we started sharing a little bit of the underlying technology and the underlying platform that we were building to do that. We saw a lot of traction from the community, from the open source community, from companies using that. And so that basically made us pivot from this Tamagotchi AI to this AI platform that we are now.
Can I ask, the thing that's really striking about what you just said there is HuggingFace today and in the last year with the rise has become a very prominent brand in the space. But 7 years, it's a long time. So when you look back, like, to what extent is the hype and the excitement that you have today around HuggingFace, to what extent is that like hype cycles driven by investors and hype cycles versus true underlying development in AI, given you've had this 15 years of experience in the space?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? That's completely true that perception and hype can be, delayed or like very different than reality. My kind of like understanding of the current situation is that the VC and the mainstream interest is kind of like a catch up on the reality. Because if you look at usage of AI, it's been massive and it's been growing massively for the past, 3 years, right? Even before ChatGPT, even before the new Bing, AI was used in Google for like billions of users every day. AI was used on Facebook to rank your posts. AI was used on Zoom to remove your backgrounds. In my opinion, the current interest about AI from VCs and the public is just a catch up on usage and on how it's kind of like become this new paradigm to build kind of like all products, all technology, all workflows. So I don't really define it as hype, more kind of like a catch up from usage with like the perception of VC in the mainstream.
Have there been catalytic breakthrough moments in the last 12 months which have taken it to the next level? Or is it just, as you said, a continuation and a catch-up from existing usage within incumbents? Like, I think OpenAI and ChatGPT to the world brought this awareness. Was that a step function change, or was that actually just the continuation of the catch-up that you mentioned?
So I think first it's really important, and I obviously have an agenda there, but to remember that most of the progress that we're seeing and that we've seen in AI is based on open science and open source. It's because AI has been so open, scientists have been so open in sharing their research, and that everyone is building on top of each other with this really interesting loop, positive loop of feedback, improvement, experiments, that we could move so fast with AI, right? Without open science, without open source, without Google sharing their attention is all you need paper, sharing their BERT paper, the latent diffusion paper, maybe we would be 30, 40, 50 years away from where we are today. And then what happened, I think, in the past few months is you started to have some mainstream breakthroughs, right? Like you mentioned, ChatGPT, and also kind of like on the underlying technology stack. I think you've had better hardware, right? And kind of like more availability of GPUs, and better optimization of models, right? With things like quantization, distillation, and all these techniques to basically be able to run bigger models at scale for hundreds of millions or billions of users sometimes. These were kind of like probably like the last missing piece for AI to go mainstream as what we're seeing right now.
So before we dive into kind of the granular, because I do want to get into kind of different models that can be approached, I do have to ask, I've done now 3 deals in AI, like any good investor has done. Thank you, Clem. And everyone they've asked, it's been with Valley VCs, and they've said, AI, the heartbeat of it is in Silicon Valley. We have to move the founders to Silicon Valley. Do you agree that SF and Silicon Valley will be the center of this next generation of AI startups? Or do you think that's bullshit and it's actually a decentralized, globalized talent network like we've seen over the last few years?
I think there's no denying that there's tremendous excitement and activity there. Proof of that, I've kind of like felt that because I was in San Francisco 2 weeks ago, and I just like tweeted that I was around and said, oh, we should do like a get together with like open source AI, fellow community members. And in a matter of few days, the thing blew up, and we ended up with 5,000 people joining for like a huge community showcase event that people started to to call the Woodstock of AI. So I really felt, thanks to this event, obviously the energy that you have in Silicon Valley right now with AI. But at the same time, if you look at the full stack, especially outside of just the early stage startups, right? If you look at AI scientists, if you look at ML engineers, it's heavily distributed, right? One data point is, for example, Llama, which is arguably one of the best open source model that came out from Meta. I don't have the exact number, but I think 10 out of the 13 authors of Llama are actually based in Paris, right? In the Meta AI lab that they have there, that is huge. So no, I think there's a lot of energy in Silicon Valley.
So for all AI founders being told you need to move to the Valley, as the founders, you need to be in the Valley, do you say that's fair, or do you say, no, you don't?
No, I don't think you do. So HuggingFace, we based, we're very, very decentralized, very distributed all over the world. I'm French, obviously, so we have a big team in Paris, but we also have a lot of people in New York, in San Francisco, all over the world. I think you have to be in Silicon Valley sometimes, right? And you can travel there. But at the end of the day, I think you can build a company from anywhere now. And the most important thing, and I'm sometimes like calling bullshit on founders saying like, oh, I need to be there for my company. I've taken like a very strategic decision to move there for my company. At the end of the day, I think it's important for founders to be happy. And if they're happy, they can build a great company. And so the most important thing, in my opinion, is for founders to find where they're the happiest, right? And if they're happy in London, they should build their company from there. If they're happy in Silicon Valley, they should build their company from there. If they're happy from like the middle of nowhere, completely separated from the rest of the community, that's where they should build their companies. It's, in my opinion, kind of like the number one criteria.
I took the same approach to my career. Everyone told me, I've been doing this 8 years, Clem. Everyone told me you have to be in the Valley if you want to be in venture, Harry. You have to be in the Valley. I fucking hate the Valley. I love London. And so I stayed and made it work. Listen, I want to dive into really the two models, really, of the world, so to speak. And I give Lee Fixel credit for this. But, he essentially posed the notion that, there's one model, which is your kind of OpenAI's view of the world, which is one model to rule them all. And then there's the other idea, which is an open source model with many models. First, before we get into like opinion, just for people to understand, how do these approaches differ?
Well, they differ a lot in kind of like where do you allocate AI builders, right? If it's just like one model to rule them all, you bet on kind of like models getting bigger and bigger with more and more generalist capabilities, and the builders of these models being concentrated in like one or few organizations, right? In the model where you think there are a lot of different models, you bet on things being more distributed, on the fact that all companies are going to actually build and train models. And that comes from the thinking that, in simplistic terms, a model or like AI is like a code base, right? It's a bit different, but at the end of the day, it's a code base, right? And so it's kind of silly to say, oh, this code base is better than this code base, or there's going to be one code base that is going to rule all code bases. The truth is, the code base is good or bad depending on your use case, depending on your constraints, depending on what you want to do, right? So if you're Facebook, you have one code base that does what you want to do for your users. If you're Slack, you have one code base that is optimized and does what you want to do for your users. And it's the same thing, in my opinion, for AI, right? Like if you're a company that wants to do consumer products, you need to build AI models that are optimized for this use case, that are going to be faster, cheaper, more efficient. And that's how you differentiate yourself.
Okay, so say with that consumer idea, we have the consumer idea and we need to leverage AI models to build what we want to build. We then have the choice of whether we choose kind of many models and the world of many models, or leveraging one model to rule them all, so to speak. How do we know which one to choose, and why do we choose which one?
It's a tough question, especially because it involves a lot of short term versus long term, right? The reality that sometimes today using kind of like one model behind an API is faster and easier at the beginning. But the challenge is in the long run, you have more risks because then you don't really internally build the capabilities to actually do AI yourself. You can't optimize these models, so they're going to be inherently more expensive. And you risk being in competition with others, not really differentiating yourself. The analogy that I sometimes like is that on the early days of the web, you could use kind of like something that would create a website for you, right? You could use the equivalent of a Squarespace, of a Wix, and that would make you feel good, right? Because really quickly you would have like a nice website up, and you can start experimenting. That's the equivalent of using an AI API for me. But the reality is that if you really want to differentiate yourself, build your capabilities, and really do something that is specifically catered for your use case, for your users, and be able to optimize that, the same way you need to write lines of code to build a technology product, in my opinion, you need to train, optimize your own models in the machine learning paradigm.
So I agree with everything you say, but I'm also aware of enterprise buying and enterprise education levels. And when you sit in Paris, I sit in London, we know how slow and bluntly ignorant large enterprises generally have been and are to new waves of innovation. And actually, if you can offer them a bundled service with a blue check mark and it's verified and safe and it's easy, then they'll go for it. Do you think we'll see a 3 to 5 year period where they go for the bundled solution because it's easy before they realize the need to embrace the more tailored?
Maybe, and that's why there's a huge opportunity for new companies to disrupt the incumbents, right? Because they're gonna go for like the easy solution, whereas like other companies that are more like AI native are gonna be going for like the more disruptive approaches, right? And you see that with a lot of startups, right? We see that with a lot of startups that are using HuggingFace. Like if you look at models closer to Runway ML or Stability AI or like Photo Room in Paris, you see these AI native startups that are actually building, training their own models, and how they can, in my opinion, build much better things than the ones that just use APIs. So, I think this what you're describing is a great opportunity for AI native startups to disrupt the incumbents who are going to go with the easier solutions, even if it's not the most sustainable in the long run.
Can I ask why? I saw actually a fantastic tweet from Jan LeCun, who said that the biggest obstacle to, the open model, so to speak, is actually the legal status of the training data. How do you think about that? Is he right? Is that the main obstacle? And do you think that's fair?
Yeah, he has a point. I would argue that it's a challenge for the proprietary approaches too, because they're also going to get challenged by that, right? I don't know if you've seen, but Elon Musk tweeted that he's going to sue OpenAI for using tweets in their training for GPT-4. So I would argue that it's a challenge for AI in general. And it's going to be good this year, I think, because we're going to start to have more legal clarity about, how do we consider fair use? What are the regulators expecting from AI companies to respect in terms of rules? So I'm excited for more clarity on regulation this year. I think it's going to be a good thing for the field as we mature.
Can I ask, what do you think happens with content access? We've also seen Reddit, who are now starting to talk about how they're going to need to monetize their content and access to it. How does the relationship between models, whether open source or closed, and content providers play out, do you think, in the next 6 to 24 months?
I don't think everyone knows. Anyone knows, really, because it's going to depend on many factors. I hope we get into a model that works better for everyone, right? For like content creators, to keep incentivizing them to create good content, and AI companies alike. We have some initiatives on the topic. For example, we've been training a really good code model with something called Big Code, and we've trained for the first time. I think we were the first organization to train on a fully opted out data set where developers could just remove themselves from the training. So we're working on the topic. There are some interesting things. We're still scratching the surface, in my opinion, both HuggingFace and the domain. But it's going to be fun to see everything that happens in the next few months for sure.
While we're on this topic, and before we dive into business model, I just have to ask, what do you think happens with the Elon Musk and OpenAI case? I saw it and I was like, why does that end?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's always hard to know what happens, behind the scenes. They're very, very different approaches. Elon Musk obviously is kind of like a character that is going to say one thing and the opposite almost on the same day. But I think he has a point in the necessity of openness for AI, and I'm sure we're going to talk a bit more about that and how important openness and transparency is for AI, but also for society in general. So I appreciate that he's putting at least this part of the conversation in the spotlight.
I do want to ask you, I spoke to many of your investors before the show, and all of them said to dive into business model and how HuggingFace makes money. Speaking of kind of the relationship with content providers and publishers there, how do you respond to how does HuggingFace money? What does that look like in the long term, do you think?
So our model is kind of simpler than what people think, right? As a platform with a lot of usage, we kind of like follow a kind of classic freemium model, right? Where most of the companies using us are using us for free. We have 15,000 companies using us now. And then a smaller subset of companies are actually paying us, right? And for us, it's 3,000 companies. And the reason why they're paying us is for premium features. So typically enterprise features like single sign-on, premium supports, right? When they need help to use our tools, and premium compute, right? For example, they want to use HuggingFace, but they want to upgrade to faster GPUs, then they're going to pay us for that. So 3,000 companies are paying us for that, including Meta, including Bloomberg, including Grammarly, and companies like that.
How do you charge them? Is it on a seat basis? Is it on a volume of query basis? What's the pricing model aligned to that business model?
It varies. I think we haven't really figured out and optimized yet for maximum revenue because our main priority is more like adoption usage as a platform with network effects.
Clem, do you get pissed off when people ask you how are you going to make money? Do you think it's the wrong question to ask?
I mean, it's not the most important question to ask, right? Because as a platform with network effects, the adoption and the usage is kind of like the number one KPI for us, right? Especially it's something that it's an assumption and kind of like a position that we took very early on with HuggingFace, especially coming also from like more like consumer backgrounds, where it's really obvious that, like a Facebook or like a Twitter, needs to focus on adoption usage first. And this kind of like assumption that we have that usage is delayed revenue, right? Especially on the domain like AI, where you expect companies to be ready to pay for AI. So if, Hugging Face keeps being the number one platform that companies are using to build the AI, it's fairly obvious that we're going to be able to make a lot of revenue out of that and build a good business around it. But at the same time, even if it's not the most important question, it's an interesting question. And the way I see it for us as a platform is that with monetization, we kind of like have to take it as like stepping stones and almost kind of like unlock some learning progressively to go from, you start with like 6-figure revenue, you learn from that, you see how it works, then 7-figure revenue, 8-figure revenue, 9-figure revenue, and you learn at each step, especially on AI, because like the underlying technology is moving so fast that probably the way we make money today is not going to be the way we make money in 3 years or in 5 years. So it's interesting to do this monetization and revenue learning that we do, I think.
Can I ask, Clem, you said about adoption there. I always think about Alex Rampell at Andreessen, who said the question in company building is, will the incumbent acquire innovation before the startup acquires distribution? And you mentioned adoption there, and it leads me to think about who gains from this next wave most predominantly. And my thinking more and more is incumbents who are fast moving, like Microsoft, who are incorporating it into PowerPoint, like Adobe, who are incorporating it into all of their suite of products. They will take 90% of the gains, actually, because they have the distribution and they're moving fast. Do you agree, or do you think actually startups are the ones who will accrue the most value in this next generation?
It's a bit related to what we talked about before. I think if you're thinking about AI as AI APIs, I agree with your analysis. If you're thinking of AI as a more radical paradigm switch to build technology, right? And if you think about an AI startup as a company that is actually training models, creating new architectures, optimizing models themselves, I think it's a different story, because this is really hard to do for the incumbents. And so I think the new startups have kind of like an opportunity there to do things 10 times, 50 times, 100 times better than the incumbents.
Why is it hard to do for the incumbents? Sorry, I'm naive here. Why is that difficult for them to do?
Because it's a completely different way to build technology, right? It's a way where you have to have scientists, for example, working for 6 months on a new architecture, on a new model before releasing it. So it's a different paradigm of how you build software, and it's different enough, in my experience, that it's hard to do for like bigger teams and bigger companies that are moving slower and that have started with like a very different paradigm. At least that's what I'm kind of like seeing on the field. It's hard to predict the future again, but I think there are many opportunities for really AI first startups, and really startups who are not just using AI with APIs, but really building AI themselves, building new architecture, building new models, optimizing their own models.
What are the biggest challenges or barriers those AI first startups face? Is it data model access? Is it hiring? Is it, you name many of the challenges? What's the biggest challenge you think this next generation of AI first companies face?
I would say hiring probably right now, like getting like the best people and getting kind of like this hybrid kind of like profile because it's science plus engineering. I would say right now, like hiring and getting the right set of co-founders, early team members is the hardest thing,
Totally get
especially
you.
because there's a lot of competition with also others. Companies have raised so much money that, like for the really good people, the salaries are kind of like insane. So that's, in my opinion, the biggest thing.
We've seen some monster funding rounds very early for some of these companies, 100 million, 200 million. Do they fundamentally need that funding for data model access for something specific? Or is it a case of the demand is there and so raise what you can? I don't understand. Does it cost more money to build AI first companies than all generation of prior companies?
It does a little bit. Um, a bit similarly, in my opinion, to how, like you would build like an internet company or like a software company 20 years ago, because compute is kind of like more expensive for AI than it is for traditional software, because the team members that you need to hire, as we mentioned, are more expensive than if you need regular software engineers. So it does cost more money to build an AI first startup than a regular kind of like software startup. One thing that I am not really sure of is if this model of not needing just a little bit more money, but much more money is really the right approach or not. Especially because we're starting to realize that more compute for models is not necessarily the right thing, or at least that it's not enough, and the return on investment on training larger and larger models is starting to go down. So it changes a little bit the perspective on raising more money and more like having more money spent on compute as some sort of a moat or barrier to entry. But like all technology cycles, you have companies taking bets, right? And if investors want to take the same bets, I don't think it's a negative thing. I think it's a good thing. It doesn't mean that they'll all succeed, right? And that it's gonna work. But it's an interesting risk to take and interesting kind of company to build, in my opinion. So I'm excited to see some of what these companies are going to build and do in the future.
Clem, can I ask, before we touch on your fundraising, which I had some great stories about, by the way, but can we just touch on, Elon has said before that fundamentally, unlike most regulatory environments, AI, you cannot wait until it's in play for you to regulate it. Once it's in play, regulation will not be effective. Do you agree with that? And how do you predict the regulatory landscape to play out in the next 6 to 24 months?
I don't really agree with that. My point of view is that, as you've heard, I'm extremely excited about AI. I think it's a new paradigm to build all tech. I believe at the same time, we're very far from a world where AI is autonomous and has conscience and is taking over the world and destroying humanity. I think this is more a fear that is very sci-fi driven, that we're very far from. And so I think when you take this point of view, you realize that regulation is necessary because, it's a new way of building technology and it's going to create some challenges. But these challenges are not so much AI running wild, autonomously, and taking over the world. These challenges are more biases that are included in these models, misrepresentations or misinformation that these models can amplify, and these need to be regulated the same way traditional technology has been regulated, or a little bit maybe differently, but not in an a priori way where you're like, let's put a pause on everything, let's stop everything because maybe it's gonna kill humanity. Because if you do that, I think you risk killing the advantages that we can get from the technology, killing the progress, and actually not solving the problems that we're seeing today that needs to be solved. So in that way, I feel like a very different approach than um, Elon Musk, but also than OpenAI, I think.
Can I ask one final thing before we discuss the fundraisers? Is there anything else which you hear often which you find annoying in terms of misrepresentation? You've been in this for 15 years. Suddenly everyone wants to talk about something that you've done for so long. And there's always this case where, like, you know something so well and it's like, oh, for fuck's sake, I wish you'd stop referring that. Is there anything that you hear today that annoys you because it's wrong?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is all this talk about AGI and anthropomorphization of AI, right? Kind of like considering and characterizing AI as human, and saying that we're close to, you know, the RoboCop scenario where AI is taking over the world and killing all humanity. The truth is we're very, very far from that. AI right now is just a new paradigm to build technology, right? Instead of writing a million lines of code, now you use machine learning to build features, to build products, to build workflows. It's an evolution that is going to be important, but it's not kind of like an autonomous semi-human being. We're very, very far from that. So that's kind of like the thing that is the most annoying to me. I think it's important to work on these topics for the long term. It's important that some researchers do some research on the topic, but at the same time, it's important that it's not taking over the whole public narrative, and that we work also on some of the challenges of AI that happen right now with the current technology, and not just kind of like a sci-fi driven long-term threat that we're not even sure is going to happen anytime.
I loved another, actually, Jan tweet which said, before we talk about godlike AI, can we please build dog-like AI?
Yes, absolutely.
But I heard some wonderful investors said the magic words, here is a term sheet before we meet. I've no idea. I mean, that is just some real balls. What happened there? Take me to that.
Yeah. So I have some rules with investors that I set for myself and that I think have been pretty useful to me. One of these rules is that I don't talk to any investors, external investors, in between rounds, right? I'm making an exception for you today because it's a podcast, but otherwise I don't talk to anybody in between rounds because I feel like a lot of the time it's some sort of a waste of time, some sort of a defocus. In my opinion, it's hard enough to build a company, not to be 100% focused on that. And so that's one of my rules. And then when I raise the rounds, it usually goes pretty fast. And so I have a window where I talk to external investors. And then at some point, I start getting term sheets. And so then I stop talking to other investors, right? When I feel like I've got enough term sheets with the people who are interested and serious, I just stop talking to other investors. And there was this funny story of an investor, and I don't think I should name him, but who arrived a little bit late in the process. And so I told him, you know, I'm sorry, you know, it's been a week. I'm kind of like, I have my term sheets. So unfortunately, the rule now is that I don't talk to external investors who haven't sent me the term sheet, right? And I was expecting the conversation to stop there. You know, I was a bit sad because it's someone who I liked on paper. But the funny thing that happened was that he said, okay, here is a term sheet before even talking to me, just like as a reply on an email. I never talked to him before, like on the phone, or like never met him.
Okay, so I'm just going to push back on you. I've learned over the years, I have opinions too, and I'm not the little Charlie in the chocolate factory. I think that's the wrong approach. And the reason I say it's the wrong approach is because people invest in lines, not dots. And if you meet me during a fundraise, it is not a long enough time period to build a relationship of trust, authenticity, respect that's going to be very prominent in your life for 15 years. And so I think you should be very careful about who you speak to. 3, maybe 5 investors who you respect intensely, and build the relationship in between, but not to speak to any. You're doing a shotgun marriage. Why am I wrong?
Well, you have a point, of course, but if you take the founder's perspective, what's challenging is to identify the investors you're talking to, because the reality is that outside of a fundraising, all investors want to talk to you, right? But it doesn't really mean that they're serious about, what you do, what you're building, and that you're aligned with them, right? So how do you pick these investors, especially in a fast-moving startup like HuggingFace, where our investors for the seed, when we were doing like the Tamagotchi AI consumer product, are very different than our investors for the B, where we're doing an AI B2B platform, right? So if I would have talked and invested a lot of time talking to a lot of consumer investors between the C and the A, it ends up basically be a waste of time. Also, something that I've seen is that an investor, I mean, you're a better investor than most, right? So I'm talking about your average investor usually has quite a different approach when they're talking to you, and they're not investors, because their whole job at that time is basically to make you like them, right? Versus when they're an investor. So it's hard to say if the relationship that you create with investors before they're investors is really indicative of the relationship that you're going to have when they're going to be actual investors. And then the last point is that I might not spend, like a year talking to investors, but when I pick them during the fundraising, I spent like a shit ton of time with them. I spent like at least like 3 days full time, which is a lot of time. 3 days full time with the investors. I do shit ton of background check. I really it's a shorter period of time, but much more intense. So I feel like it's still giving me a good signal of like, is it going to be a good relationship? Are we aligned? Are we kind of like similar expectations and all of that? So I'm not saying it's perfect, but for me it's been working well, I think.
I think you're totally fair on the pivot element. I think that's a very unique element of HuggingFace, where you're right. You could have spent time with consumer-facing investors, and maybe it would be a different type of investor that does later. Totally get you there. In terms of who guides you, your seed investors. You have Thibaut. Thibaut knows everyone. Thibaut is essential, and you have a great roster of people on your cap table. I think, for founders listening, it would be your seed investors very much so who guide you. And then I think what I would say, and sorry, Clem, I didn't mean to push back, but fuck it. People love it when I push back. And say,
oh, that's good.
The idea of like intensity of relationship within 3 days, that is a completely manufactured relationship. I will tell you anything you want to hear, baby. It is a relationship of hierarchy and imbalance. The reason why raising or like communicating outside now, why this is great. I'm not selling you shit. You're not selling me shit. I'm just getting to know you, and you're getting to know me. And when the 3 days are in, I'm selling you or you're selling me, and it's like a marriage where that doesn't work. It's an equal balance, but in those days there is an imbalance, which means you're not getting a purity.
I'm not sure. I think it's closer to the founder-investor relationship than, you and I talking like that without, any kind of like really fundraising goals in mind. It's also a different relationship now than it is, if you would be an investor for Hugging Face, I feel like.
I would love to be. Thank you. It worked. It worked. This interview style worked. I
Yeah,
suppose.
so because the flip side of the coin of me not talking to external investors between rounds is that if I do, then it means that you can become an investor, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't work.
It would, and that's why I'm a good
Just kidding.
investor. I lull you into a full sense of security, and then I pray. I spoke to Brandon Reeves before the show, wonderful mutual friend of both of ours, and an investor in Hugging Face. He said you have some spicy takes on the venture ecosystem. What are your spiciest takes on venture?
Well, I mean, I think something I believe in is that investors are first and foremost investors, right? Meaning that their main value adds is to do your rounds, to help you on financial matters. So, for example, when SVB go down, right, and then to help you to always capitalize the company the right way. So if they're doing their seed, their main job is to help you to do their Series A, your Series A. If they're doing your Series A, their main job is to help you do your Series B. And that's almost like 95% of the value of an investor, to be financially supportive, help you capitalize the company, right? And I think right now a lot of investors have kind of like a little bit forgotten that, and they focus most of their time on other things. They sometimes act almost as CEO or like operators for companies, which in my opinion is now really their job. And worse than that, I feel like sometimes entrepreneurs or building companies for investors, and investors are behaving like entrepreneurs, and sometimes it's actually crashing companies, just because contrary to an entrepreneur, unfortunately an investor has a lot of different companies, right? So they can't only spend like a short period of time on each company. And even if they're like the smartest people in the world, that just is constrained in terms of time, big seats, so that they have sometimes more simplistic understanding of like the technology, for example, of kind of like the company and things like that. So that's kind of like maybe one thing where I differ a little bit to some other entrepreneur or some kind of like a conception of venture.
I totally agree with you. I think a really big problem is entrepreneurs building companies for investors, or in a way that they think investors want to see it. Totally agree with you there. Well, final one before a quick fire, Clem, and it's your cap table's fantastic. I love Lux, I love Lee, I love Pat at Sequoia. It's fucking awesome. But you are French and you are in Paris, and I'm just interested. What do you make of the European venture ecosystem? Because that was not on your cap table other than Thibaut.
Yes, I have French angels, right? When we started, our first investors were BetaWorks and French angels. I don't have a lot of experience with European venture, because after that we only had US VCs. So I'm not sure if I would become like a good judge of it.
I totally get that. Shit question.
Yeah.
Final question then. You've raised money from some of the best in the business. What do you know now that you wish you'd known at the beginning? Or what do you advise founders, having seen all that you've seen?
Well, I mean, for company building, I think one thing that wish I knew earlier, is that it doesn't get easier. Like sometimes when you like an early stage founder, you're like struggling and you're like, oh, but that's gonna be good. I'm gonna struggle. It's gonna be really, really hard. But in 1 year, in 2 years, when I'm gonna be bigger, it's gonna be easier. I'm sorry, but it won't be easier. The truth is that each stage has a lot of challenges. And so I think something important is for entrepreneurs to realize that and enjoy what they're doing now and try to find and build the company that they enjoy building instead of like forcing themselves to suffer. And like that, they can build just the enjoyment and the joy from, building, not the joy of, getting to a Series B, getting the Series C, getting to IPO, but really the joy of building, right? The joy of the journey, of the entrepreneurial journey. And I think it completely changes your adventure.
Someone once said to me, it doesn't get easier, it just gets different. And I thought that was a good
Exactly.
summary. Yeah. What's your fundraising one? And then we'll do a quick fire.
Something I didn't expect is that the way you raise isn't so much dictated by your stage and your rounds, but more dictated by the situation that you're in terms of traction, in terms of momentum, in terms of like achievements, right? So you can have a Series C that is like extremely hard. It's going to take you 6 months, struggling like crazy, and like a pre-seed that is like super easy. Or you can have it the completely opposite way, right? You can have a Series C that is going to be done in a week, very simple, very little work. And then you can have like a pre-seed that is a struggle that you're going to struggle for 6 months. So that was an interesting thing for me because maybe naively as the founder, I was thinking that it was the higher you went, the hardest you would get, or like the longest you would get, the more kind of like data driven it would get. Whereas in reality, not so much. Fundraising always ends up being like a contract between two parties, right? And it can be super quick, it can be super fast, it can be super complicated, it can be super simple. It depends more on the power relation between the two sides of the contract, basically.
Totally. I mean, the contract that we have was at the end of this interview, you'd sign the term sheet, right? That was what your team said.
No, I never signed this contract. Sorry.
What? At least we met. I mean, it's better than the last one. Listen, I want to dive into a quick fire, Clem. So I say a short statement, you give me your immediate thoughts. Does that sound okay?
Okay, yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so what do others not know that you know to be true?
Well, I mean, we talked a little bit about it before, but I think the biggest thing is, in my opinion, all companies will have their own AI models. Like all companies will have their ChatGPT or like their GPT-4.
I love that. I just asked someone the other day that, and they said the amount of love your child gets from the age of 0 to 5 will dictate how they act when they are older. And I asked you the same, and it's just such a brilliantly different answer, which I love. Tell me, what is the single biggest risk to HuggingFace today, do you think? What do you sit around with your team and co-founders and go, this is at risk?
Well, I mean, the biggest kind of like market risk for us is that if AI fails to deliver, right? Like being kind of like an AI platform, if AI fails to deliver, it's not gonna work for HuggingFace, no matter what. So that would be kind of like the biggest risk. That's why we're taking such a community open source approach to things, and we're being so community driven and supporting the whole ecosystem. Because at the end of the day, if AI wins, we win. And so the most important thing is that we contribute to the community, to the ecosystem for this to happen.
You said that Brandon's your favorite VC. Who's your favorite angel? Who's the most impactful angel that you've had?
You're gonna get me in trouble for that. If I have to pick one, I have many really, really great angels. You mentioned Thibaut Elisière in Europe, but I would go with Richard Socher, who's one of the most prominent scientists in NLP. Is like a chameleon. He's been one of the most influential researcher in NLP. Then he went to join Salesforce, and he was the chief scientist at Salesforce for a few years. And now he went back to starting a company, and he's starting this company U.com, which is disrupting search engines. And he's been one of my favorite angel investors. Has been with us almost since the beginning and has helped us in so many different topics because of his background from the science side, the business side, or the entrepreneur side. I really enjoy having him part of the adventure.
Following. What a great dude. Wow. Okay, great answer. Love that one. Tell me, what's the most painful lesson that you're also pleased to have learned because you learned a lot from it?
Well, I mean, I said that before, but the fact that nothing gets easier is probably like the biggest one for me, because it changed my mindset, right? Once I realized that nothing was getting easier, I started to focus much more on the process, much more on, not building a big company or not building kind of like the biggest company, but building the company that I enjoy building and that I think needs to be built. And so it changed quite a lot my mindset, and it proved to be quite useful and impactful, I think.
Penultimate one. What's the hardest role to hire for today for you?
I would say, machine learning engineer. And by machine learning engineer, I mean someone who's really building new architecture for AI models and able to train state-of-the-art models. There are just, in my opinion, a few people in the world who has been known and who has done that in the past, maybe 50 to 100 people. Hopefully there's going to be more, and there are a lot of people who've never done it before who are going to be able to do it now. But it's a very, very short supply in terms of like number of people, and a very, very difficult background to hire for right now.
Clem, final one. If all the stars align, if everything goes right, how big could Hugging Face be, and what company is that in 10 years?
I don't know if it's a good question for me, because I think our goal is not fundamentally to build like the biggest company of all. I mean, we see that more as kind of like a side effect of building something impactful, useful for everyone. And one actually of the advice that I give a lot of entrepreneurs that I meet is to make sure to remember to build like the company that they want to build and the company that they think is needed to be built, even if that means not being obviously like the biggest company. So hopefully in 10 years, HuggingFace would be the most impactful organization and company in AI, in this new paradigm that is AI. And then maybe a side effect of that is that HuggingFace is like the biggest company of all, but that's not, in my opinion, kind of like the number one goal. It's almost a side effect of having an impact.
Clem, listen, I've loved this. I haven't got you in trouble at all. There's no term sheet coming your way from me, sadly, for me. But I so appreciate you taking the time, my friend, and I've enjoyed it immensely.
Likewise, it was an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time.